So the big question for this morning was, is there going to be a children's sermon? Did we not have a children's sermon? Did not the children speak to us? Did they not preach to us? Are your spirits not lifted by them? All of them. Can I ask you kids, how much time did you put into that? Lots of time. Did you guys practice this at home also? Yeah. You guys had what we old folks call grit. You worked hard at it. And it feels good, doesn't it? Well, if it doesn't feel good for you, you need to know how good it feels for us. And most importantly, above making you feel good, above making us feel good or me feel good, I just can't imagine how good you just made God feel. Thank you from the depths of our hearts. All of you. We'll get there. It takes steps, right? So a retired man in the Grand Canyon Junction of Arizona calls his son in New York and says, I hate to ruin your day, but I have to tell you that your mother and I are divorcing. 40 years of misery is enough. Pop, what are you talking about? The son screams. We can't stand the sight of each other any longer, the old man says. We're sick of each other, and I'm sick of talking about this. So you call your sister in Chicago and tell her. Then he hangs up the phone. Frantic, the son calls his sister, who explodes on the phone. Like heck, they're getting divorced, she shouts. I'll take care of this. And she calls her dad immediately and screams at him. You are not getting divorced. Don't do a single thing until I get there. I'm calling my brother back, and we're both going to be there tomorrow. Until then, don't do a thing. Do you hear me? The father hangs up the phone, and not quite as cute as that, says to his wife, okay. He says, they're coming to Thanksgiving, and they're paying their own way. For their 50th wedding anniversary, they invited the kids, both of whom now were married for just shy of a decade, to the Grand Canyon Lodge. And as they gazed at a view similar to that on your screens and in your bulletin, the son leans over to his wise old dad and says, what's the secret to 50 years of marriage? And the dad says, you see the Colorado River down there at the bottom of the Grand Canyon? It carved through all of that rock, not because of its power, but because of its grit. How's that for a wedding homily? For a relationship homily? For a life homily through these last years? In like manner, the justice-minded widow in today's gospel text has grit. Despite the uncaring judge's indifference to justice, indifference to fellow human beings, and indifference even to God, the widow prevails because of good, old-fashioned grit. You know you've made it in this world when you are known by a single name. And like this A&E list of top 10 most influential people and leaders over the past 1,000 years, the top 10 all go by a single name. Starting at number 10, Galileo, Copernicus, Einstein, Marx, Columbus, Shakespeare, Darwin, Luther, Newton, and number 1 on the list? Any guesses? Prince. He knows me too well. He said Prince. Ew. Any guesses? Gutenberg. Think about that. Gutenberg. Without exception, each and every one of these remarkable persons met total resistance, complete rejection, absolute failure. They practiced and they tried, but when the day came, they were overcome with emotions and couldn't get there. But they had grit. Despite the fact that these individuals represented diverse insights and radical advancements in science and politics and literature and religion and technology, they're all tied together by one common trait. Each of these historically exalted individuals were widow-like in their grit. Please don't worry about this. We've been here before. We know what's going on. We have 2 doctors with John right now, and it's all going to be okay. Grit. They all had good, old-fashioned grit in the face of seemingly insurmountable opposition. Now, this parable that Jesus gave is not just about grit. You might have missed it. It was right in the very beginning. It's about grit, gorilla glued to prayer. In his book, Outlive Your Life, Max Lucado tells the story of what one of his Brazilian church leaders taught him. The Brazilian met Lucado and told him that he met Christ during a year-long stay in a drug rehab facility. His therapy included 3 one-hour sessions of prayer each and every day. The patients were not required to pray, but they were required to attend the prayer meetings. Dozens of recovering addicts spent 60 uninterrupted minutes on their knees. Lucado expressed amazement and confessed that his prayers were short and formal. The Brazilian leader dared Lucado to meet him for prayer, which he did the next day. And they knelt on concrete floors of the small church auditorium and began to talk to God. Strike that, says Lucado. I talked. He cried and wailed and begged and cajoled and pleaded. He pounded his fists on the floor, shook his fists towards heaven, confessed and reconfessed his brokenness, every blemish, every break, every blasphemy. He recited the promises in the Bible as if God's self, needed a reminder. He prayed, Lucado says, like Moses. Moses on Mount Sinai is not calm and quiet, with folded hands and a serene expression. He's on his face 1 minute and in God's the next. He's on his knees, pointing his finger and lifting his hands. He's shedding tears. He's shredding his cloak. He's wrestling like Jacob at Jabbok for the lives of his people. The Brazilians and Moses' prayer, that is grit, gorilla glued to prayer. Prayer does not change God's nature. Who God will be and is will never be altered. Prayer does, however, impact the flow of history because it changes us all the way down to the cellular level. Grand Canyon-like, prayer changes us. Agnes Sanford, in this month's session reflection, says, only the amount of God that we can get in us will work for us. Listen to that again. Only the amount of God that we can get in us will work for us. God has wired God's own world for power. And God calls us to wire every room of our lives with grit, gorilla glued to prayer, so that we can get as much of God in us as possible. Then, when you walk into a dark room, it will be so natural, so second nature to just flip on the switch. And as John Wesley says, we will be empowered to do all the good you can by all the means you can, and all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. The truth is, most of us, self included, struggle with prayer. We forget to pray. And when we remember, we hurry through the prayers with hollow words. Our minds drift. Our thoughts scatter. Our self-esteem shelters. And you know what happens? Our power shatters. Why? Why is prayer so difficult for all of us? Prayer requires minimal effort. No location is prescribed. No particular clothing is required. No title or office is stipulated. Yet you would think that we're wrestling a greased pig. Speaking of pigs, our brokenness, and yes, I just called myself a greased pig. Our brokenness is what keeps you and me from prayer. Our brokenness gets between us and others. Our brokenness gets between us and God. Our brokenness gets between us and who God created us to be. But our brokenness scampers like a spooked dog when grit is gorilla glued to prayer. So, morning prayers, afternoon prayers, evening prayers, breath prayers. Yeah, I think the ancients were onto something, don't you think? Our heroes of faith were onto something, don't you think? Martin Luther, who some of you have heard me say this before, the reformer, right? On that top 10 list, I think he was number 3 or 4 or something like that, right? Was a busy man. He preached eloquent sermons every single day. He wrote commentaries on every book of the Bible, I believe, except for the Psalms, which he preached on. He stood up to the church he loved and wanted to improve. And one of my favorite quotes of his, on the busiest days of my life, I spent the most time in prayer. That's how he got all of that done. Does God call us to preach without ceasing? No. Or to teach without ceasing? Or to have meetings without ceasing? Or even to sing without ceasing? No, but God does call us to pray without ceasing. Does Jesus declare that my house shall be called a house of study, a house of fellowship, a house of activities, potlucks and all? No. But Christ does say, my house shall be called a house of prayer. No other spiritual activity is guaranteed such results. When two gather and make a prayer of it, God in heaven goes to action. In short, God moves history through humble, gritty, prayerful hearts. Friends, when good old-fashioned grit is gorilla glued to prayer, transformation takes place. It wires every room in our lives to choose peace in the face of violence, to choose love in the heights of hatred, and to choose life in the depths of loss. Grit glued to prayer wires our lives and turns on the light that shines in the darkness. The question is, are we going to flip on the switch so that the darkness will never overcome it? Amen? Amen.